Most slaves did not go to a church as we think of it. They especially don't go to many black churches. There are a few free African Americans in the South or slaves in urban areas like Charleston, South Carolina, that attend black churches, black Baptist churches, and especially African Methodist Episcopal churches, the AME. And this is the strongest national black church. It was formed by Richard Allen in Philadelphia in 1816 and is really important to African Americans in the antebellum period, especially free African Americans in the North. But most plantation slaves either went to white churches with their masters or they worshiped on the plantation. Maybe the plantation owner preached to them, or maybe he brought in a preacher, but most African Americans are not going to black churches at this time. But this isn't really the slave religion that we're talking about. The slave religion that we're talking about is nicknamed the Invisible Institution because the real religious service for slaves was practiced at night in secret and led by black preachers. It included a lot of singing and shouting and dancing. And we see that African influence, that influence of African religions in that. And there's chanting, by which we mean the congregation would hear a call from the preacher and then respond. There's a real emphasis on movement. You wouldn't see a lot of movement in white churches at this time, but in the slave religion, in these secret services held at night in the woods far away from the master's house, there's a real emphasis on movement. And it's not just an imitation of white religion. It is evangelical Protestantism and all that means, plus some elements of African religion, like we just talked about, the movement and the singing and the call and response. But it's also a real emphasis on the Bible stories about enslaved people. They really emphasized people in bondage and their implied right to be free in those stories. For example, the Jews being freed from Egypt and then crossing Jordan and arriving at the Promised Land. Also, Jesus setting sinners free of the bondage of sin. The message that many slaves got from these stories of the Bible is that we will be set free. Slaves will be set free when God calls them home. We can see this as religious salvation, as an afterlife. And that's what they told the masters. When the masters asked them, what do you like about those stories? They said, we like the idea of religious salvation. We like the idea of an afterlife, of being saved in a religious sense. But it also gave them hope that God freed people, like he did for the Jews in Egypt, and that he punished their enemies, like he did to the Pharaoh and the slavers of Egypt. This also helps slaves see emancipation, their freedom, as something that has been preordained, that God has already decided that slavery will end and they will be set free. It's only a matter of time. And this is why Abraham Lincoln is sometimes compared to Moses in African American literature and speeches of the day. In those worship services, there are some other differences. Conversion for African Americans, for slaves, is more likely to take the appearance of possession by spirits, and that's how they would describe it, and that's how somebody might describe it if they saw it. If you were at one of those Second Great Awakening meetings where white people were experiencing conversion, it would look like being struck down. These people would literally faint or collapse or fall on the ground at these revivals that white people attended at the time. Sinfulness and a fear of hell is really not emphasized in slave religion for obvious reasons. Life on earth was hell for slaves. They have no freedom. They're forced to do manual labor for someone else from sunup to sundown. They're separated from their families. They're beaten. Life on earth was hell. So they don't talk much about hell in a biblical sense. They don't emphasize sinfulness. It's more about joy of life. It's more about keeping people's spirits up. Because religion is going to help slaves endure bondage, endure being a slave without losing that sense of inner worth. As a result of religion, slaves are able to think of themselves as spiritually superior to their master. In fact, some slaves believed that all whites were going to hell for slavery. Those that owned slaves and those just that allowed slavery to exist were going to hell. And that all blacks, free and enslaved, were going to go to heaven. Religion also plays an important significance because it is a place where they can create. It is a place where they can control a world of their own. They can create a sermon, they can create a song, they can create a dance or a musical arrangement. And preachers in slave religion were granted status from their community, not from the master. Yes, some slaves were named team leaders. Some slaves were even used to keep other slaves working, but those were positions that were granted by a master. They carried no weight once the work was done in the field. That had no significance within this slave community. But a preacher who is given this position by his congregation, by his community, by the people that he lives with, the other slaves, has a great deal of respect as a result. And those singers also have a position of status. Those singers also have a position to be creative. In short, slave religion is very key to African American culture in the antebellum period, and it is essential to slaves resisting the dehumanizing aspect of living in bondage. It helps create community, it helps bring solidarity, and it gives slaves self-esteem.